Open note, open book. You know, I mean, I have that. Yeah, like, but we. I have to ask. I think that's a fair question. So let's see. We are live and launch the.
And my computer was about to knock it out.
Yeah, I wasn't here last week.
The turn on right before I left.
So today's lecture, because we're finishing talking about employee responsibilities.
Yeah.
See if the thing will come up.
It's kind of wells. I just found it, but it's just kind of hard to take. I know how that makes sense. We have to work something.
All right, so we talked about that. This is going to be kind of a short class period, and then you're going to have the rest of the class to work on your exam since you're so concerned about, having plenty of time to get this done. I'm going to give you some, some time in class to go and finish working on the exam. We talked about these narrow views of responsibilities, and we stopped with looking at learned professions and ethical codes. So historically, colleges and universities developed out of the church and there I am talking to myself. Exactly what's on the narrated PowerPoint. See, colleges and universities emerged out of the church largely, and the three learned professions were the first sort of foundations of why people went to college. The oldest of those being theology, and the church needed a way of informing people that were going to be clergy about sort of the doctrine of the church. And as far as ethics go, that's one of the types of ethics you can have. You can have religious absolutism or rational absolutism in terms of, an ethical theory. The other learned professions were the law and medicine. And they developed very complex codes as a result, the Hippocratic Oath in medicine, and then the legal profession has developed a very strong code. So we'll look at some of that and use it as a reference for, let's see if I can get this to switch, how these ethical codes developed. Come on, there you go. And what their foundation is. As more and more occupations have joined the ranks of what we call the learned professions. And in the United States, there are now a plethora of these that have requirements for a baccalaureate degree in order to enter them more and more. You see more and more societies developing these kinds of codes. And that's generally, in my opinion, a good thing. Why is this not? Let's see. Let's try that. See back there, it works. Not sure why it's not doing the left. No. Let's do this. So this is the ABA's model code, and almost every state has adopted the model code of ethics. And you can see there are like tons of rules in the model code. Now, the thing that I think is important when we look at these is that you have an understanding, and one of the things that happens, in my opinion, is that as we professionalize these different occupations, is that there is a reliance on, well, just follow the code and you'll be okay, without any sort of recognition of the thought behind the code. So why is it that we have these sorts of rules? How did they come down to us? And what's sort of the thinking behind the code? Well, the attorneys have a fairly detailed code, and there are lots of comments in the code about what this means. But I think this blind adherence to them can be problematic. So for example, let's look at one of the lawyer-client relationships. Confidentiality of information. A lawyer shall not reveal information relating to the representation of the client unless the client gives informed consent. The disclosure is impliedly authorized in order to carry out the representation, or the disclosure is permitted by paragraph B. So then we go to paragraph B. A lawyer may reveal, and I'm sorry, I'm having allergy problems, so my voice is like fluctuating today. A lawyer may reveal information relating to the representation of the client to the extent the lawyer reasonably believes necessary to prevent reasonable, certain death or substantial bodily harm. Right? So we have all of these now, these exceptions to the rule. So historically, lawyers were prohibited from talking about their representation of a client, but there are these exceptions to the rule, right? So what is to prevent reasonable, certain death or substantial bodily harm? If you're representing a murderer, right, serial killer, and you know that he's going to go out and commit a crime, tonight, well, that might be necessary. So why do we have this rule? Let's start with just the confidentiality. And lots of professions now have this sort of confidentiality rule in their codes of ethics. Accountants have now developed codes of ethics. I think the Bar Association is probably the most detailed. But why do we have this sort of idea of confidentiality?
Right of privacy.
Okay, if you have a corporate client, do you really have an expectation of privacy if you have like this publicly traded corporation as your client?
It could be like personal privacy. Doesn't necessarily have to be the business.
Okay, so protecting the rights of the employees that are utilizing your services. All right. Why else would we have this duty of confidentiality?
Just respect in general.
Okay. The autonomy. Let's look at what involved in that terms. Let's look at what's involved in this idea of informed consent. What is informed consent? When can a client reasonably give their consent? There are two prongs to the informed consent test. One is that it is knowing, right? And the second, that it's voluntary. All right, so knowing, this prong of the test is fairly simple. Are you conscious when you're making this decision? Voluntary becomes a harder test. What is a voluntary? Consenting to do it?
Like you're not forced to do it.
Yeah, but how much do you have to be forced? Obviously, at one end of the spectrum of voluntariness is I'm holding a gun to your head and saying your brains or your signature are going to be on this consent form. And obviously that's not voluntary.
Like an act of free will.
But how much do you have to have in order to have, I mean, there's this extreme, right? Your brains or your signature are going to be on the consent. Obviously that's not voluntary because most people are going to sign under duress in that situation. But how much is knowing and voluntary. How much is, so free will, it's an act of free will. Obviously, the will is overborne if I'm sitting there with a gun to your head and saying these things to you. But there are more subtle instances in which you can have a less knowing and voluntary, right? So knowing, you're conscious, you're not in a coma, you have some awareness of your surroundings, but voluntary. When can the will be overborne such that it's no longer really voluntary?
Family?
Okay, if you have a relationship, a familial relationship with the individual. So if I'm an attorney and I'm representing my family, maybe that could influence the decision of the individual, which, by the way, as an attorney, if you all decide to become attorneys, don't represent your friends and family. It will always end poorly for you.
What if somebody's like terminal illness or a coma, where they literally cannot make a decision?
Yeah, I think that's a good one. If they have a terminal illness, maybe they're still conscious, but they're not really able to make a complete and informed decision. And at that point, the will becomes overborne. So it's not just, what do we think about when we have these codes? It's not just following the code to the letter of the law, but also understanding the nuances of these codes and their applicability to everyday life, and what informs, what kinds of ethical theories inform the rules. So what kind of ethical theory can we use to support the confidentiality of the major? And as you're writing, again, it tells you that you should focus on the valid ethical theories, not the invalid theories, which are what we call challenges to ethics. So the valid theories are, duty ethics, duty, utility, virtue, and moral minimum. What kind of theory supports this idea of confidentiality? Well, we could say duty, because lawyers have a duty to their client, right? How do we know this duty? Well, the code tells us this duty. How did they come up with the duty in the code? Well, these kinds of ideas are sort of necessary if you want to have something that resembles a fair and impartial judicial system, right? If you want to have something that resembles a legitimate judiciary that is independent, you have to have advocates that can maintain confidentiality. There are lots of states where this doesn't occur. You don't have the right to confidentiality with your attorney. They have these trials in places like Russia that resemble American trials, but they're really not, because they don't have the full set of sort of rights that you have. The oligarchs in Russia all owe their allegiance to one person who made them all wealthy. And when they have turned on him, several of them have, been imprisoned or had their things confiscated. And their attorneys don't necessarily have the right of confidentiality. So if we think about these, you can argue a duty, you can also argue utility, which is that on the whole, by and large, these rules lead to, in the aggregate, greater results of fairness than if we didn't have these rules, right? You can also say that there's a virtue ethic in these. The idea that you should keep confidences, that's, part of Aristotle's, I think, virtues. If you look at sort of the 13 virtues that were developed by Franklin, largely, based on his reading and his life experience, the idea that you should not, speak out of school. So we have these codes that are being formed, and more professions as we professionalize occupations are turning to these codes. The thing that I think is important about these, and what I've tried to stress here, is that you can't just have blind adherence to the code for the sake of the code itself. And you have to think about these things because there are instances where things are not going to be covered by the code, and you're going to be called upon to make judgments about whether or not you should engage in certain type of behavior. As marketers have enormous amounts of power in terms of our ability to persuade people. And one of the things that a lot of philosophers argue now is that marketers have actually turned marketing on its head. It's no longer about satisfying needs and wants, but in many instances, some philosophers argue that what we're doing as marketers is creating irrational wants and desires in people. That we are creating this sort of self-fulfilling need that has no ends. There's a movie with Demi Moore that sort of highlights how this works, and what they are is they are sort of rogue marketers. It's called the Joneses, as in Keeping Up with the Joneses, and it's this fake family that they send into a neighborhood to do basically guerrilla marketing. The family is given all of this stuff. They live in this big home and they're given all of these things. Any of you seen this movie? It's a funny movie to watch. It has kind of a tragic ending. They are given all of these things, and basically by guerrilla marketing, what I mean is that they're supposed to use them. You know, it's like they give the father this ultimate set of golf clubs, which he then takes the neighbor out and says, well, you should try my driver. And of course, then the neighbor has to buy that driver because, you know, it's been recommended by the Joneses and it's keeping up with the Joneses. So are we creating irrational wants and desires? And if so, is that ethically problematic? Or should we just assume that people have free will? Well, it's not clear to me that we do. In one of my lectures that's on video, one of the questions I asked in the early set of lectures, if you watched it, was, can we will ourselves to not want what we want? And determinists would say that we can't do that. We can't will ourselves to not want something. We may, in fact, not act on a desire, but for a determinist, they would say, well, that's just because you want something more than you want X, Y, and Z. So, for example, shoes. I like shoes. I like Allen Edmonds shoes, right? I think I told you all this. I have like 16 pairs of Allen Edmonds shoes. I just love them. I think they're absolutely beautiful. I don't have every single pair of Allen Edmonds shoes that I'd like to have because I don't have either the money, resources, or I want to keep the money that I have, right? But for a determinist, they would say, you didn't want that either. You didn't will yourself to want that either. Can you really will yourself to not want something? I don't know. It's really hard to think about. So are we turning these principles that we use to influence people on their head and creating irrational wants and needs, and thinking about that, again, as we professionalize these codes, what is the purpose behind the code? What is the theoretical basis? And a lot of people argue that we don't have philosophers in business and that we just need to rely on the codes sort of blindly because we're not all trained in the art of philosophy. But my argument to that is we all, to some extent, philosophize about these things, whether we think about it or not. Consciously, we all have a tendency to sort of have opinions as to why we behave in certain ways. So these codes are becoming more and more prevalent, and I think that we should think about what it is that goes into the making and the formulation of these codes when we act, because a lot of times just blind adherence to the code may lead to ethically problematic decision-making. So the learned professions, medicine, theology, and law, the first of these. Now we have all kinds that have proliferated. I have friends who have taught at Oxford, and they come to America and they laugh at sort of the professionalization that Americans have done of all sorts of things. One of the things that we have, for example, here at UCO that we offer is a degree called recreation. I took that class. My last semester, I thought I need an easy class. I had taken all of the hard classes. I deliberately planned my last semester to be really easy. I waited to take my physical education requirements. Do they still have a physical education requirement? Do you still have to take some like walking or fitness? I know that you have to take wellness and positive lifestyles, which, teaches you really useful things like you should brush your teeth. If you haven't figured that out by now, I don't know that we can do a lot to help you. But, they had a requirement when I was an undergraduate that you had to take, I think, 6 hours of some kind of physical education. And I waited until the last to take 2 of them, and I took weight training and some other one. I thought I'll really, learn something about weight training. I'd done it all my life since I was, like in junior high, but I never had any like formal, and I was really expecting to learn something out of this. It was taught by a football coach who just came in, threw down the roll sheet, said sign in and leave when you want, and then proceeded to work on his, plays. And I was kind of like, wow, you take this job seriously, don't you? You're more worried about the football team that nobody comes and watches than you are about like the students who might actually like want to learn something here. So anyway, recreation. We have this recreation program, so I took that as well. I took recreation and leisure lifestyles, and I thought, well, I know how to recreate. This will be an easy class. That was actually a really hard class because you had to go to all of these recreation sites and you had to spend like an hour. There were like 16 of them. We had one a week, and you had to spend an hour, and the instructor had like, she had it down where, and these people were like, they were adamant about you spend an entire hour. And it's like, after you've been to one gym, how many hours do you really need to spend? But it was about seeing how different recreation sites operated and things like that. But so we have this degree called recreation and leisure, and it's a professional degree. And again, my friends who teach at Oxford or did, they're now retired, laugh at that and think, why do you need a degree? If you want to run a gym, in England, what do? You open a gym. You don't get a degree in it. We also have degrees at OSU called turf management. It's a really, important degree. What do you do with the degree in turf management? Anybody guess?
Put turf down.
You what?
Manage turf.
Put turf down. You run golf course, it's all about how you keep golf courses alive, basically. Because, there's different soils, and you've got to have greens that are, mowed just so. But anyway, these professionalizations have now all started adding all these codes, and I think we need to think about what it is. Let's go previous. All right, so managerial responsibilities and conflicts of interest. Corporate versus non-corporate managers and their responsibilities. So what is the responsibility of sort of the executive suite versus lower levels of management that are not necessarily making broad decisions? One of the things that I think that corporate has to think about, if you're a corporate executive, in terms of broad ranging policies, what is it that we're producing? What is it that we should be producing? And how do we go about making that more ethical? And this has become a big thing amongst your generation, particularly as you all are more responsive to companies that at least outwardly appear to have some kind of corporate social responsibility. Companies like Tom's and Bombas, who are doing the 1-for-1 in terms of giving back, not just taking, but also being good stewards of resources and helping people and the planet and profit. So with regard to this, we often talk about what's called the triple bottom line that corporate executives should focus on, which is people and planet and profits. Corporations should make a good profit, but not at the expense of degrading, for example, the planet or the people that are employed by that company. It's going. With regard to these ideas of agency principle, loyalty, obedience, and thrift, I've told you that I think loyalty is somewhat problematic in an age in which corporations, for the most part, have acted in ways that don't seem to have any loyalty to their employees. They view very much employees as being cogs in a machine, and we saw this with sort of the scientific management theories that you know it's about figuring out how much coal you can shovel in a given period of time and achieving the right balance in terms of the shovel that you need to do that, right? These sort of absolute time and motion studies that were pretty dehumanizing. So if corporations don't have a loyalty to you, should you have a loyalty to them? Because loyalty involves something that resembles sacrifice. Again, corporate versus non-corporate, if you're talking about officers and executives in the C-suite, oftentimes corporations do have something that resembles loyalty to those employees because they provide them with things like golden parachutes. There was a famous case called In Re Disney. If you want to read about, I like Disney. I'm kind of a Disney fanatic. I love to go to Disney World. We go almost every single year to Disney, and there's a competition that until the last 2 years I got to go to, and they paid for us to go to Disney because the International Collegiate Competition is held every year in Orlando until they went virtual because of COVID. And so we get to go, and they pay for the last day of the competition after it's all over, the award ceremony, for everybody to go to one of the Disney parks. So I really love Disney. Well, in a derivative lawsuit, a bunch of the shareholders, including Roy Disney, who was the nephew of Walt Disney and was the last remaining Disney family member on the board, sued the Disney Corporation when Michael Eisner was running it as CEO, because Eisner invited one of his friends to be head of the Disney theme parks. And this was a guy who had never had any experience in running a publicly traded corporation. He was a multimillionaire, but he had been a talent agent in Los Angeles. And that's how Eisner knew him. Well, there's a big difference between running your own talent agency and being an agent for stars and performers and running a publicly traded corporation. What Eisner had done in order to recruit this guy to come into Disney was he made it more valuable for this guy to get fired than he did for him to stay and do his job. And the argument on behalf of Disney in this derivative lawsuit was, look, if we want to attract top talent, these are the things that we have to promise in order to get them to give up the current position that they have and come to work for us. We have to offer them something that assures them that their risk taking is going to be worth it. Right? And the shareholders, including Roy Disney, ultimately lost, because although there is this duty of thrift, it's tempered by something called the Business Judgment Rule, the BJR. And what the Business Judgment Rule says is that with regard to corporations, when you have these derivative lawsuits, so what a derivative lawsuit is, and it was filed in the Delaware Court of Chancery. That's where most corporations are headquartered, or not headquartered, but they are incorporated in Delaware, and that's because Delaware wrote the original code on corporations. Most corporations, even if they can't organize in Delaware because somebody else has a similar name that's already filed in Delaware, they generally tend to choose states that follow the Delaware code, because there's this whole body of law that is developed out of the Delaware Court of Chancery. And they said, yep, it sure seems like he made some bad mistakes, that Eisner made some really oopsie daisies, but business is inherently risky. And taking those risks is what leads to ultimate reward for shareholders. And sometimes those risks turn out badly. And if we constantly second judged or second guessed all of these things, wouldn't that create, just enormous amounts of lawsuits and ex post facto trying to go back and rationalize. So at the corporate level, what do these mean as opposed to sort of a line manager who's just dealing with the day-to-day? Obviously, we don't expect managers who are just dealing with scheduling and fulfillment and procurement and things like that to have maybe the same level of loyalty that we have for the C-suite executives who have things like golden parachutes, which provide some degree of loyalty on behalf of the company. Because if you're fired for anything other than gross negligence or illegality, you're covered, right? You walk away with, stock options or grants and severance packages, which, go into the millions of dollars. One of the more famous one that didn't end well for the executive was actually one that was involved Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. Warren Buffett is the Oracle of Omaha, and his alter ego, the vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, is Charlie Munger, and they had to take over at the request of the United States government, Salomon Brothers, after Salomon had engaged in enormous amounts of sort of illegal trading in their bond market, and they were going bankrupt. And they decided that they weren't going to pay the chief executive officer who had overseen all of this and who was at the top any of his severance package. And he took them to arbitration. And when the arbitration was over, he actually walked away with nothing. He got not one dime in the severance package. But that is an unusual situation. So the duty of loyalty, obedience, and thrift. This one, again, with regard to non-corporate, just so your middle level managers and employees, is very controversial, but these two are not. You should follow what your employers tell you to do, unless, of course, there's some reason that you can't because it's illegal, and you shouldn't waste. Which brings us to whistleblowers on this idea of obedience. What do you have to be a whistleblower? And whistleblowers are generally, by the way, not treated very well. The whistleblower that came out when Enron was involved in this horrible accounting fiasco, which basically they were offloading all this debt into special project entities, which allowed them to look better than they were on paper for investors, and lots of people lost all their money. That person, and it was a female, she never worked in the corporate world again as a result of her whistleblowing. And I think we all agree that, probably there needed to be some whistleblowing in the Enron case. The Enron case is not particularly interesting from an ethics standpoint because it's a duh case. I mean, like anyone, you would have to have had this ethical sensitivity of a banana slug to not understand that what they were doing was just a priori wrong, right? I under any version of ethical reasoning, duty ethics, virtue, utilitarian ethics, it was just wrong, right? I mean, under any of those. So it's not even a really close case. So what do you have to have whistleblowing? Well, you need to have a real threat. The threat can't be hypothetical or imagined or trivial, right? I mean, everybody engages in some amount of, probably ethically questionable behavior. Should you ever lie? Right? Should executives ever lie? Is it okay to lie in business? Kant would generally say no. How many of you have seen a movie called Pretty Woman? This is the example I give. It's a very old movie. I'm surprised that a lot of you have actually seen this movie because it's ancient. You watch this movie and you realize, I watch it and you realize kind of how old it is because of the technology that they're using. the old cell phone in the limousine, which was like attached to the car, which nobody like would have that now. So Richard Gere plays an arbitrageur in that. And of course, he comes to realize from his relationship with this woman that he doesn't make anything. That, you know, what they make is money. And they engage in arbitrage. So what they do is they buy companies, they break them up, and they sell them because they're worth more as pieces than they are as a whole. In one scene, he tells this guy who's trying to take over the shipyard, and he tells the owner, you know, your contracts, this guy says, well, we have contracts with the Navy to build ships, and we're going to do that, and I can pay you off. I can pay you back. And he says, no, you don't. You don't have the contracts. And he's bluffing, turns out. At the end, the guy says, well, what about our contracts? And he says, well, they were just delayed. They weren't really dead. And the old gentleman says to Richard Gere in sort of a kind of a patronizing way, well, you're very good at, you know, sort of bluffing. And Richard Gere says, yeah, that's my job, right? It's basically my job to lie and bluff. Is it ever acceptable to lie and bluff in business? Kant would say no. You know, others would say, depends. Utilitarians, right? What's the outcome? Is the overall outcome going to be better, not just for your shareholders, but for everybody in general? Then maybe it's acceptable. This keeps going, scrolling fast. So there has to be a real threat. You have to seek to prevent harm through internal means. That means that you should use all, before you go public with this, you should exhaust all internal remedies that you have. Publicly traded corporations require that they have ethics officers as part of Sarbanes-Oxley, and that they have procedures in place for people to report violations of company policy, rules, or, you know, illegality. So you have to seek to prevent the harm through internal means, and you have to exhaust all of those. You can't just file an ethics point. We have these here at UCO. We have an ability to file, if you think something's going wrong, an ethics point, which goes to the Board of Regents. It's anonymous, and they're required to investigate it. You can't just do that and then instantly go out and run to the news media, right? You have to exhaust all of your remedies and make sure that is done before you then go on and become a whistleblower. And again, generally things don't turn out well for whistleblowers, because even though we may recognize that they've done some great public service, like in the case of Enron and WorldCom and Tyco, which all involved some whistleblowing activity, the simple fact of the matter is that no other company then wants to hire those people, right? Because they're afraid that you're going to be a whistleblower on them. So, the meaning and value of work. I think we've talked a lot about what it means to have a job, a career, or a calling. What kind of values do we want to have as corporations? Not everybody can have meaningful work, right? But if we can't all have meaningful work where we get to be the fullest expression of ourselves, for example, in this job that I have here, I have a lot of ability to be very creative. I'm not an artist. My mother's a great artist, and she can play the piano and the guitar and all these things. I am a tone deaf flat baritone. I think I told you all I wanted to be a country and western superstar, but you know, I'm a tone deaf flat baritone. I love karaoke. My friends and family absolutely, like, if there's a karaoke bar, I'm going to be there, and they hate it because, again, I'm a tone deaf flat baritone. So I had to become a college professor, which allows me to have this kind of, you know, ability to be expressive and creative in the way that I present materials and sort of do my stand-up comedy routine in my ethics classes. That's very rewarding, but not everybody can have that. So how do we provide at least an ethically safe workplace for those people that are more vulnerable? One of the things that's nice is, you know, about having tenure is that it's really hard to get rid of you. I used to have a dean when I was in the Office of Legal Counsel. I was responsible for going around and training screening committees on how to hire, what you could and couldn't say, for example, in the hiring process. And one of the deans that was was in the College of Liberal Arts at the time, used to go into these screening committees, and she used to say, just remember that it's very important that you select the right candidate, because if they get tenure can be forever. You can divorce a spouse easier than you can get rid of a colleague who has tenure, right? I had a professor who stabbed a student with a pencil, had tenure, couldn't get rid of it, as hard as we tried, right? So the meaning and value of work, what are the rights that we have in the workplace? What responsibilities flow from those rights? And then how do we create organizations that involve and engage in living the brand to ultimately be better for not only shareholders, but stakeholders, employees, and the community as a whole? And I think one of the good examples for those of you who are interested in this idea of living the brand is Southwest Airlines. Southwest employees are fiercely loyal to Southwest. I've never had an employee ever, and I know several, I have some friends that work as A&P mechanics for Southwest, that ever say anything bad about that company, because they are just fiercely loyal to their employees, and their employees by turn are fiercely loyal to them. So I think it's a good example of one of the companies that we can think of as living the brand and creating good value for their customers, clients, and society as a whole. All right, so I'm gonna give you the rest of the time to work on the exam. I am behind on grading, I apologize. I hope to get your second exam essays graded as quickly as I can. I've got other classes that have turned in papers, so I go through and try to get everything done in time, in order of what is turned in. If you got ducks, come and see me, yes.
When is exam 3 due?
Like you have a week. It's open today and you have a week to do it,
Okay.
isn't it? We had one 2 weeks ago. I know, everything gets compressed at the end of the semester.
I was like, all right, took it, no
So-
worries.
Right, yeah, okay, so you have to put in on D2L, it says that it's extra credit. The way it's calculated, it's just a total number of points. If you look at the syllabus, I think there are 700 points possible. So it's just total number of points. D2L will not let you put in a value of 0 for a graded item.
Okay,
You
so
have to
just-
put something in there.
Okay.
And so the default is usually to put like 100. So it's not 30 out of 100.
Just go off the syllabus.
Just, yeah, just the total points, just add your total points up and then divide by,
Okay,
so-
because I just wanted to
36
know.
out of 100.
I know, I saw 30 out of 100, I was like, was that?
Yeah,
either
it's-
look or not?
Yeah.
You want? Here,
Yeah, I didn't know
here you
that.
go. Okay, good job.
I started thinking, I was like, did you say consider?